Pete must resign. That is the saying that is meandering around Congress, starting with Marco Rubio. You remember him from some time ago. He said, where the heck has Pete Buttigieg been? And he sent a letter over to the Biden administration saying, enough already. We've been following this guy. Airplanes don't work. Trains don't work. Supply chains don't work. And this guy is just out giving little lectures in front of weird halls with other people who look and sound like him, who are giving lectures to themselves repeatedly, talking about other weird, interesting issues that nobody cares about. So that's what he's been doing. And he has been very slow to respond to this Ohio derailment situation. And we have this clip of Pete, which it seems to sort of downplay the level of catastrophe that is happening in East Palestine, Ohio. Department of Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg says trains get in accidents all the time. And this one happens to be, particularly bad, but it happens all the time. And so why is everybody freaking out? Let me go back on vacation.
Look, rail safety is something that has evolved a lot over the years, but there's clearly more that needs to be done because while this horrible situation has gotten a particularly high amount of attention,
unfortunately,
there are roughly 1,000 cases a year of a train derailing.
That doesn't sound good. Right. It's like, this happens all the time. OK, you idiots don't know anything about trains. If you were as smart as I was and went to whatever school I went to and was the mayor of a town, and you were also appointed to this very prestigious position, well, then you would know this happens all the time. But what doesn't happen all the time that he just glosses over is the chemical nuclear bomb that went off that is going to continue to compound in effects for some years to come. So one more time, here is old Pete.
Look, rail safety is something that has evolved a lot over the years, but there's clearly more that needs to be done because while this horrible situation has gotten a particularly high amount of attention, there are roughly 1,000 cases a year of a train derailing.
All right. So not a big deal. Everybody stop making so much ado about the situation. We have another clip from our Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, and he is very unhappy with Mayor Pete, says enough with this guy. It's time for him to go. We've been complaining. He's constantly gone. Nobody knows where he is. Enough already.
And I don't know what the guy needs to do to get fired because he's been asleep at the switch, no pun intended, his entire time in office. Whether it's meltdowns at the FAA, whether it's what happened with Southwest Airlines, now this derailment of toxic chemicals. But his job is to make sure that not only is our system of transportation in this country reliable, but that it is safe.
And he has not been doing such a good job at that. Sort of month after month, there are continual issues, one seemingly after the other. And so Marco Rubio said enough already, sent a letter over to the Biden administration saying it's time for him to resign. Let's take a look at it. Drafted February 16, 2023 from Marco Rubio from Florida. He's on a bunch of different committees. You can see one, foreign relations, appropriations, and so on. He sends this letter over to the president, Joe Biden, at the White House. He says, "Dear Mr. President Joe, I write to urge you to request the immediate resignation of DOT Secretary Pete, who has repeatedly demonstrated a gross level of incompetence and apathy that is detrimental to the safety and prosperity of the American people." True. For 2 years, Secretary Pete has downplayed and ignored crisis after crisis while prioritizing topics of little relevance to our nation's transportation system. It is painfully clear, says Marco, to the American people that Secretary Pete has little regard for the duties of the Secretary of Transportation. At no time has that been more apparent than the past 2 weeks. Secretary Buttigieg refused to acknowledge the disaster in East Palestine, Ohio, until his intentional ignorance was no longer tenable. Even after acknowledging the tragedy, I think that was on Twitter, by the way, he continues to deflect any accountability for the safety of our nation's rail system. The circumstances leading up to the derailment point to a clear lack of oversight and demand engagement by our nation's top transportation official. Unfortunately, says Marco Rubio, this is a part of a 2-year-long pattern. During historic maritime and surface transportation disruptions in 2021, Secretary Pete was completely absent. Amidst an impending possible rail strike last year, Secretary Pete left the country to vacation in Portuguese wine country. Shout out to my ancestors. Near misses in commercial aviation, as well as recent system failures, including the one that shut down air travel in Florida in January, indicate that serious and persistent problems across the DOT are not being sufficiently remedied. I do not, says Marco, I do not have confidence that Secretary Pete is capable of keeping the American people. He says Secretary Buttigieg is allowed and alleged to have abused taxpayer dollars by chartering private jets that are costlier than allowed in federal employee travel regulations, including for international travel. Oh, Pete likes to fly private. Isn't that nice? Very, very convenient for our friend Pete. He is the Department of Transportation leader, secretary. So that's probably how he justifies that to himself. I do run the DOT. I'll take private. Similar instances in previous administrations have led to resignations if they had any self-respect. But Secretary Buttigieg is also alleged to have used government aircraft for travel that may be political in nature. The American people deserve to know that their tax dollars are not being abused by Pete for personal or political purposes by government officials, and that public officials are being held to the same standards regardless of their political affiliation. For 2 years, says Marco Rubio, the transparency and accountability that you promised to obsessively uphold, Joe, during your inauguration has been nowhere to be found. The incompetence and failure within your administration cannot continue to be ignored when Americans' health and safety are at risk. I hope you will change course in order to uphold your so far unmet promise to the American people by requesting the immediate resignation of Secretary Buttigieg. Sincerely, your friend, Marco Rubio, U.S. Senator from the great state of Florida. Shout out to our friends in Florida. All right, well, that's a nice letter, and I like it. Pete Buttigieg, resign, from Marco Rubio, and the murmurings ignite around Congress. So there are other questions about what old Pete has been doing. Now, you're going to hear Ted Cruz in a minute talking about less politics, more leadership out of the DOT. But there's a question about where Pete has been. What's he been doing? What's he been up to? Well, this photograph was dug up by this person on Twitter. Shout out to our friend Will of Snow on Twitter. He is a Twitter user who posted this: Norfolk Southern CEO and his buddy, Mayor Pete. Very, very interesting, isn't it? Look who this is. The Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. And look who this fella is right here. That's the Norfolk CEO, probably talking about insurrecting the railroads, aren't they? Or maybe not. Who knows? But interesting things are popping up now. Not that it means anything, but it is an interesting photo. And we have Ted Cruz, who's also in Congress, and he is having a conversation saying, look, Pete Buttigieg is in charge. It's time for him to stand up, take questions, and provide answers.
I have to say I'm disappointed by the absence of a Senate-confirmed witness like Secretary Buttigieg, who ultimately oversees the agency responsible for the NOTAM failure. And I would note that Secretary Buttigieg, in my view, instead of engaging in politics, should be focused on the job he has now and addressing the very serious transportation crises we are seeing playing out across the country.
Well, he's not doing a whole lot of that. Instead, he is making it a lot more about politics. In fact, we saw him tweet about that on his Twitter account, which is really where we've seen most of his response to this entire saga on Twitter. In fact, we talked about that yesterday. There was a very weird unification of the sides when Ted Cruz and Ilhan Omar yesterday, they were in agreement. They said Pete Buttigieg is gone, like absent. Nobody knows where he is. The mayor has said that. The governor of Ohio has said that. Everybody's wondering where he is. And he just posts on Twitter. He's like, oh, good. You two are getting along now. Give our office a call. Let me know. I'll, get off vacation in Portugal and I'll come back and I'll address something. But that has not happened yet. Instead, he is still hopping on Twitter. In fact, this is what he said when he blamed Trump. He said, all this is not my fault at all. It's Congress's fault. And if it's not Congress's fault, it's Trump's fault. And if it's not Trump's fault, it's the railroad's fault. He posted this on February 14th, on Valentine's Day, no less. Very inappropriate. Everybody's trying to love each other, and he's spreading blame around, even though he's responsible. He said this. He said, "We're constrained by law on some areas of rail regulation, like the braking rule withdrawn by the Trump administration in 2018 because of a law passed by Congress in 2015, right? Trump's fault. But we are using the powers we do have to keep people safe," which kind of sounds like a whiny, complaint. Well, it's other people's fault, but we're doing the best we can with the tools we got. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to save all of you because it's Trump, right? Kind of sounds like that. Now, there was a lot of questions about this. There was, deregulation, lobbying, both parties passing rules, and it's a big question about who did what. And there are still, interestingly enough, open questions about what ultimately caused the derailment in the first place. So Secretary Pete seems to be spreading disinformation, or at least misinformation, about the cause of the derailment. He's blaming the change in the law for potentially being the cause of the accident, but he can't prove that because we don't know what the cause of the accident is. So does it have to do with what that law would have fixed or not? Who knows? But somebody who does have experience, probably a lot more experience than Secretary Pete does, is named Jennifer Homendy. And she had a very interesting thread in response to Mayor Pete's claim that this was Trump's fault and this was somebody else's fault other than his. Here's what she wrote. Before we read this very astute thread, let's understand who this woman is. This is her personal account. She is the NTSB chair alum, right? So she's no longer on the board. Same entity that is doing a lot of the investigation here. So she's at Transport Dems, at Teamsters, Swim Bike Run Mom. She's a Starbucks addict. Hopefully she, get some help for that. Official updates and follow the NTSB. Okay, so the NTSB is where she is the alum. This is the chairman, right? This is the entity that investigates these accidents. It's a government entity. So she is responding to this. Here's what she says. All right, everybody, listen close. Here's what I have to say about the thread on the East Palestine derailment. She writes, first, a message to the community, and then a plea to those spreading misinformation like old Pete Buttigieg. Says here, to everyone affected, know that the NTSB is working vigorously to understand what caused this derailment so it never happens again. In other words, we still don't know what this means, how this was caused. This was at 5:33 on February 16th. She says, you have my personal commitment that the NTSB will continue to share information publicly as soon as possible following this analysis. Here's a link to our February 14th update. Remember when Pete Buttigieg was spreading that misinfo? He posted it on Valentine's Day. She says, next, the NTSB investigators will thoroughly examine the tank cars once decontaminated. As always, we'll issue urgent safety recommendations as needed. Says urgent safety recommendations may be issued at any time, meaning don't wait until the end of our investigation. If we need action now, we'll tell you now. She says nothing. She said it twice, so she means it. Nothing is more important than accuracy at a moment like this. You got to be accurate. So you don't want to be the Department of Transportation secretary just spouting off at the hip. Which is why the NTSB is deliberate in our approach to investigations. Credibility is essential, unless you're the DOT, to our life-saving mission. The NTSB process works. See how here. Click the link to learn more. She says, that leads me to my last point. Anyone speculating about what happened or didn't happen or should have happened is misleading a suffering community. Please stop spreading misinformation. She says, for example, and here's Secretary Pete. Remember, here's Pete. We're constrained by the law on some areas of rail regulation, like the braking rule withdrawn by Trump, right? What does that mean? This is Pete sort of implying, if Trump wouldn't have done this, we would have fixed this, and this would have not happened, right? That's what he's implying. He posted this on February 14th. So, that's a very politically charged statement, blaming Trump for this. Let's see what an actual leader and authority figure who knows how this stuff works has to say. Back to Jennifer. She says, to anyone speculating about what happened, please stop spreading misinfo. Some are saying that the electronically controlled pneumatic brake rule, I wonder who she's talking about. Some. Who is she talking about? Who could possibly be saying that? Some are saying that the ECP controlled brake rule, if implemented, would have prevented this derailment. But she said that's I think she's referring to Pete. She's not being explicit about it, but who else could she be talking about? He is the Department of Transportation head, right? And he was spreading misinformation on February 14th. Maybe they should ban his accounts from all of the platforms and debank him. So this is what she says. False. Why? The ECP braking rule would have applied only to high hazard flammable trains. The train that derailed in East Palestine was a mixed freight train containing only 3 placarded 3-class flammable liquid cars. So they weren't categorized in a way that would have made the brakes apply. She says this means even if the rule had gone into effect, Dum Pete, this train wouldn't have had ECP brakes. Hello. She says for a reminder of the history of the ECP, see this graphic below. And you can read through the history on that if you'd like. Somebody should send that to Mayor Pete. Hopefully he's tagged in this. She says, I urge you, okay, let our entity, the NTSB, lead the safety analysis. She's basically subtweeting Mayor Pete. She's saying, oh, you know, shut up, please. Let us take over here. Anything else is harmful, okay? You're harming America, Mayor. Anything else is harmful, adding pain to a community that's already been through enough. But if this derailment has moved you to want to become a safety investigator and go work for the NTSB, we'd love to have you go apply for a job. That's a great way, yeah. Everybody's got to drop their links at the end of a good tweet thread. Make sure you join our community at watchingthewatchers.locals.com while you're there. All right, so very, very nice tweet thread from her. I think that was very good. Everybody just, calm down. Mayor Pete, stop blaming Trump. This was all okay, we're trying to figure out what the investigation was, the cause it was, and the investigation is not over yet. And so old Mayor Pete is having a difficult time handling this response. So that is the update from Mayor Pete. Now, another story, of course, came out. FEMA is apparently denying aid to Ohio. How could that possibly be, you might ask? Well, we turn over to Fox News and they tell us. They say this was published on February 16th in the afternoon. They write, the Biden administration turns down Ohio's request for disaster assistance after the toxic derailment. FEMA continues to tell Governor DeWine in Ohio that they are not eligible for assistance, according to the governor's office. What? How is that possible? The Biden administration, according to Fox, turned down a request for federal disaster assistance from Mike DeWine. FEMA told Ohio state government it's not eligible for disaster assistance. That's according to Dan Tierney, a spokesman for DeWine. Told that to Fox News Digital on Thursday. Tierney said that FEMA believed the incident didn't qualify as a traditional disaster, like a tornado or a hurricane, which is what we need them for. The DeWine administration has been in daily contact with FEMA to discuss the need for federal support. However, FEMA continues to tell Governor DeWine that Ohio is not eligible for assistance at this time. That is what DeWine's office said in a statement. DeWine will continue to work with FEMA to determine what assistance can be provided. FEMA said, yeah, no, we've been talking to them, but we're not giving them any money. No, of course, we're answering the phone for them, but no, we're not sending them anything. That's ridiculous. We need that money for communities that vote Democratic. All right, and so we have more. A lot of people are questioning why Ohio can't get any federal government money when this is the situation with the White House and other countries.
And to deliver much needed humanitarian assistance as well as food, water, medicine, shelter, and other aid to Ukrainians displaced by Russia's war, and provide aid for those seeking refuge in other countries from Ukraine. It's also going to help schools and hospitals open. It's going to allow pensions and social support to be paid to the Ukrainian people so they have something in their pocket.
Yeah.
It's also going to provide critical resources to address food shortages around the globe.
Yeah, that's good. Hopefully they get everything they need. Meanwhile, FEMA can continue to deny Ohio resources. Sounds good. Perfect. And the rest of the world is also having fun with this because they are dunking on the United States. And I remember all of these statements that when Joe Biden was going to come in, the whole world was going to just stop and pause in awe at the level of sophistication and professionalism and just outright maturity and steadfast wisdom of this administration. Unfortunately, that's not really what we've seen. We sort of have the Taliban getting verified on Twitter now. We've got Russia invading Ukraine, China sending spy balloons overhead. We have the government allowing that to happen before shooting it down. It's like a never-ending joke, right? Literally like a joke. And they said that the world was laughing at Trump. This is what the Chinese are saying outright from their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He says the Nord Stream gas pipelines are vital transnational infrastructure. This is at the bottom. I can speak a little bit of Mandarin. Let me translate. He says the explosions have had a serious impact on the global energy market and ecological environment. Mm-hmm. He says if the American investigative journalist Hirsch is telling the truth, and it was the U.S. who attacked the pipelines, he says the act is clearly unacceptable and it must be answered for. He says the U.S. owes the world a responsible explanation. And he just asks a very simple question, this little Chinese communist. He says, what we want to ask is why those media outlets that have always been claiming themselves to be a free, professional, and fair, talking about U.S. media, have made few reports on the latest Nord Stream investigation. It's an interesting question. It is an interesting question. He says also, look at this. He's rubbing it in our faces, man. He says also, why are they not reporting on such a major incident as the train accident that caused the chemical leak? You see that there? Why aren't they talking about the train accident that caused a major chemical leak? Which is threatening American people's lives and safety, he says. As far as we know, it is not the first time that this has happened. All right, so that's that little communist dictator from China lecturing us about our government. But it is amazing that they just sort of openly call that stuff out. It doesn't bode well for the ongoing relationship. We're going to see if Secretary Blinken brings that up when he goes over there, because he's having a difficult time too with them. And they're having a difficult time in this Biden administration. A rough time with foreign policy and domestic policy and a lot of other policies. But now that FEMA has denied sending money, we've got Josh Hawley, who says that is unacceptable. He is a senator from the Homeland Security. He is asking the Homeland Security Committee to convene hearings, he says pronto, which means like really, really fast. Not just fast, really, really fast. Pronto on Ohio's FEMA relief denial. What it means for states like Missouri downstream and the growing crisis in this country's transportation. So Hawley's also sending a letter on this thing. So the train derailment story is turning into a big story. The Republicans are diving in. Rubio wants a resignation. Now Hawley is demanding hearings. So February 17th, drafted by Josh Hawley, senator from the great state of Missouri. And our red pen's a little bit thin here. Let's girth it up a little bit. All right, better. Says here, the Honorable Gary Peters, chairman of the Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee. Chairman Peters writes, Josh Hawley writes, Chairman Peters, I write to request that you convene a hearing on federal disaster relief efforts to address the transportation-related incidents taking place across the nation, not just Ohio, all of them. As members of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, we have an obligation to conduct oversight over our federal disaster response, says Hawley, specifically as carried out by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. It is imperative that we conduct the oversight to study and investigate any potential shortcomings in our disaster response and preparedness, especially those given the serious nature of these recent events. He says, as you may know, there has been significant attention and concern in recent weeks over multiple transportation-related incidents across the nation, most notably a train carrying a highly toxic and combustible chemicals derailed in East Palestine, Ohio earlier this month, leading residents of that community to evacuate. Authorities have said that multiple chemicals are, quote, known to have been and continue to be released into the air, and surface waters and subsequent testing has revealed contamination in some of the Ohio River tributaries. But FEMA has so far denied relief, and other recent incidents have prompted similar concerns, including train derailments in Houston, Texas, Detroit, Michigan, as well as a nitric acid spill in Tucson, Arizona. Events like these, says Josh, threaten our critical infrastructure. They disrupt our domestic supply chains, and they uproot the lives of normal Americans. They also raise concerns over how the federal government responds to such incidents. The American people, says Senator Hawley, not least the local residents of East Palestine and others affected in their communities, deserve to know how their federal government, including FEMA, is responding. If there are any gaps in our efforts, it's the duty of this committee to bring them to light. Thank you for your attention and consideration. Sincerely, your friend, Josh Hawley, United States Senator. So that is going to be interesting. We'll see if they convene them. We always like some good hearings. And of course, Josh Hawley is a Republican. He's in the Republican Party, which is in the minority in the Senate. So this will sort of be up to the Democrats, who are still in control of the Senate, to make a decision about whether those hearings will take place or not. We'll see if they, do they really want to open that can of worms? I think it's much more likely that we'll see something like this in the House of Representatives at some point, but only time will tell. In the meantime, we've got Marco Rubio and we've got others demanding more from the Biden administration, including that Pete Buttigieg be asked to resign. We'll see if that happens. I wouldn't hold your breath. I'm not going to hold my breath. We'll see. But we'll continue to cover. Thank you for liking this video. Thank you for subscribing and following along, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next one.